or good evening, wherever you are and whenever you are listening in, dear Halathaz followers, readers, subscribers, and now listeners, to another installment of the new Halathaz Network podcast, this time hosted by me, Kyle. I just finished up a 2-month hiatus from all social media, and during that time, I read through the newest book from a friend of mine, friend of mine, Chris Robertson, who can be found on Instagram at Caffeine and Philosophy, as well as his own website by the same name. Chris and I met a number of years ago, probably 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, down at a get-together at Waldgang, and we hit it off right away. I feel we hit it off right away. Expecting, of course, that anyone who was present there was most likely going to be pretty good company. Nonetheless, whether it was the first time, it was probably the second time that I went down there. He gave me a copy of one of his older books at the time, Letter to Anwe. We even talk about that, the pronunciation. It's a reconstructed word. Where he discussed an idea of a collective ancestral spirit, which is also, I found, very intriguing. I liked his approach to subjects, of course, compelling subjects at that. Great linguistic control, good arguments. Really just overall clever dude, classy guy. Like you, Chris. You're a good dude. So the timing of his newest book, which we are more or less discussing today, or at least the themes explored therein, couldn't have come at a better time or been more aligned with what we're exploring here at Halathaz at large, both the pursuit of contemporary heroism and in living as competent men in our current age. So while I do mention a couple of times in this chat the title of his book, if you want to look him up, barring you aren't already following his works, posts, what have you, you'll come across his works and all of his books there. So that is Chris Robertson, C.B. Robertson, The Hero and the Man, Language, Truth, and the Homeric Origins of Western Idealism. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy. Recording in progress.
So pleasant.
All right, Chris. So thanks for joining me on here to banter for a little bit about your brand new book, The Hero and the Man.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes. It sounds so much better when you say it.
Yeah, with my ever so slight lisp that a lot of people have pointed out, but that I don't hear myself in my own voice report.
Is that a Canadian thing, or is that just you? Because when you put it that way, I think back of like Jordan Peterson and Viva Fry and Lord Southern, and like, is there's something unique about the Canadian voice? I'm not sure what it is.
I have been told that I had a acquaintance from LA years ago that said, "You have such a thick Canadian accent," and I was like, "We sound the same. I don't hear any difference between us." But my lisp is me. I have an odd tongue tie that I suppose I came over when I do the TH sound. It goes to the side of my teeth rather than the front.
Ah, gotcha.
First note that I took, I've got a stack of notes here about your book. The first one, and obviously, I mean, your argument through the book kind of develops and travels. It's not like it's not piece by piece by piece. I found the book to be extremely cohesive, and each successive chapter sort of it reframed what you spelled out in the previous chapter. I found it to be a very organic flow, that each chapter argued against the previous one, and until it became a cohesive theme over the course of the entire book. It didn't seem disjointed at all.
Cool. Well, glad to hear. That's an improvement on some of the previous ones, according to my wife.
Well, it's been years since you gave me that copy of Letter to Anwe.
Ooh. Anwe, yeah.
Anwe. Yeah, it's been years.
It's a reconstruction anyway, so no one cares how it's pronounced.
Well, I enjoyed that one as well, and I should reread it because it's another relatively quick one. The 120 page whatever ballpark or 200 page range. Yeah, so I should revisit that, and maybe we'll banter about that a little bit from what I recall of it. But anyways, first note that I took was the part where you mentioned that a big portion of Achilles living forever as a hero in song and in story is that there's an issue of translation as well. And you break down a lot of the issues of translation in this book regarding particular words like aletheia, and I'm sure you're going to pronounce it better than me, truth, and that's more precisely means more direct and open rather than truth insofar as we know it now. So why don't you go on about the issue of translating from ancient Greek and the issues that we get from that?
Yeah, well, this is for any, I don't know what your audience is like as far as religious breakdown, if you're pagans or atheists.
I think we've got everyone.
Some Christians. It's one of the fun things about any kind of translation work, and you see this a lot with the Bible too, is you have all of these words that their literal English translation is one thing, like logos means word, for example, but it could also mean other things like logic or grounding principle of order, or whatever you want it to be. And aletheia is one word for truth, but it's not the only word for truth. And you have other words like dike comes to mind, which means not truth in the sense of aletheia, but it means straight or just. It was the connotation that came out of that straightness. And these words acquire these connotations over time through these mythic and heroic stories. They acquire more meaning. It aggregates like a snowball rolling down a hill until you get these very thick, meaningful, powerful, deep words. And as soon as you translate that, you can understand 90% of the literal meaning of what's said, but you lose that certain something that gives the depth and the significance, especially at a local cultural level, to these ancient stories. And so the importance of understanding the language, and this is awkward to say about Homer. I'm speaking as someone who has all these books on Homeric Greek, but who does not actually speak Homeric Greek. I mean, no one actually, believe it or not, spoke Homeric Greek.
You have bamboozled us.
Homeric Greek was a version of Greek that was never spoken by anybody, except for the rhapsodes who recited it, because it was originally written or written down in parts in one version of Greek, and then translated in full into a different form of Greek. But some of the translations couldn't be completely done because it would ruin the dactylic hexameter of the lines. So they opted to keep certain lines and certain words in the original form, and you end up with this kind of pidgin language, this sort of hybrid language that was never spoken by anyone in a conversational manner.
Okay, so sort of like how we wouldn't casually speak in rhyme in our day-to-day life.
Right. No one speaks in dactylic hexameter or iambic pentameter
yet,
unless you're certain pretty much, unless you're Eminem or something.
I wouldn't put it past those guys, Zach and Yoan. If you've ever interacted with them beyond a couple of comments or anything, they're the kind of guys to totally try and do that out their day like that.
Some people have a special skill for sure.
Yeah. That translation stuff, that makes sense. And I figured that was somewhat what it was like. You end up with, hey, here's this word. And I mean, the classic, a lot of us have talked about Vajra before and how it means like adamantine, diamond, eternal, thunderbolt, plasma, weapon, all these things. And if you look up a translation, there's like 20 different possible translations.
Yeah.
But seeing all of those potential translations for it actually gives it so much more depth, because you can see, okay, well, what was the relationship? Why are all of these things related in this one word?
Yeah. And there's a certain, this is the beauty of poetry, is it gives you the ability and the practice in leveraging these multiple connotations from a single word. And so you get, words that have connotations, words that are virtual synonyms but have completely different sets of connotations, and you can do all kinds of things with a well-developed language of that kind. that you can't do with the one of the things that has annoyed me in the last 3 or 4 years, going deeper into not just Greek, again, a novice amateur there, but also English, not as amateurish, native speaker and all. And it's a very common thing. You'll hear people, especially from like the Reddit world, to complain about how irrational and stupid English is, because it has all these different grammatical rules and none of it makes sense. And the spelling doesn't make sense, and this and that and the other. Whereas, you have a language like Japanese that's by contrast very straightforward enunciation. There's one character that you don't enunciate and everything else is golden.
Yeah.
But like that complexity is part of what makes English so powerful and so versatile. You have musical artists in other countries who write lyrics in English, not just for the audience, but because I think the Spanish audience is bigger now than the English audience, but
probably
just so that they can use the power of the English language with all the Anglo-Saxon words that it is based in, and the Greek and Latin roots that can give it a certain higher sound to it. Orwell was not a fan of that. And of course the French roots that have also been a big part of English, and there's a great history to it too. And if you want an experience of that history, you can go and read the not the translation, but Beowulf in its original form, which you can find online, I believe, but it's in English, but you wouldn't know it reading it.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's one for Zach. He's a total linguistic autist, undiagnosed autism in regards to language and etymology. But yet you're talking about the magic and the power of English. And I mean, we're both obviously native English speakers, and I'm assuming that you, being American, probably speak a decent amount of Spanish. Or
I wish I had taken Spanish. I
Okay.
took Japanese instead, because in high school all of the kids who didn't want to try took Spanish. So I'm like, I'll go with the kids who want to be in class. And so they all went to Japanese.
Japanese is offered in American schools?
It was, yes, especially on the West Coast.
Oh, interesting.
Where we have a lot more Japanese speakers.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's probably not long until Mandarin is in our courses up here in Vancouver area, but I mean, we just have French. So I mean, essentially, you've probably got smecklings of other languages to competent degree. I mean, my German has definitely faded since I lived there and learned German, but I would argue that, I mean, English strikes me as, and there's going to be lots of people who will say otherwise, and it's about how you use it, but English strikes me as a limited language in a way, or maybe it's just the way it's employed today, that we see. Look, I'm already struggling to find the correct words and ways to articulate this, but is that a personal limitation, or is that a limitation of English?
Well, yeah, it's I would agree with you insofar as, I mean, all languages are limited, and that's what brings it back to, these heroic tales are what give us the language to talk about things. There was a professor, I don't remember his name, a great fan of Homer's though, and he said one of the greatest thing that Homer did with his language was to give us the descriptive furniture with which to relate to each other. He gave us language to use, but that language is limited by the story, and all languages have these limitations, and they have different limitations. That's why some things sound better in French. Some things sound better in English. I was speaking to someone who was trying to make an argument that mathematics is really a kind of language, is best understood as a language. And of course, the things that you will think about if you're thinking in mathematical language are going to be a little different than the things you think about if you're thinking in English.
Oh, totally. I mean, I've even been saying that to some of the pastors at that church that I've been going to, that sort of learning and immersing myself in Christianity has been like learning a new language, and that I'm able to now look at like biblical scripture or priests as, I'm like, okay, well, that story is just telling this archetypal story and this story. Oh, well, look at that character. He's just this, like flicking through, being that it's kind of, the coolest chapter in the Bible, Revelations, right at the end, flicking through that, you're just like, oh, that just sounds like Ragnarok. Oh, well, look, there's the story of Kronos devouring Zeus. Oh, that's just Jupiter. Oh, well, that's that. And, who like, which, it says something along the lines of like the mother bore the child in front of the red dragon, but he was born up to heaven. And
yes, Revelation.
and the first thing I thought was, I'm just like, oh, well, that's just Rhea giving birth to Zeus and giving Kronos the stone instead, and then Zeus is hidden away and he comes back later with the rod of iron to rule. So it's all, all archetypal stories, and I have a feeling that a lot of us in this general sphere we're really drawn to that archetypal stuff, and are we looking for a source in those?
Well, possibly, and we know that we know with some certainty that some stories do have a common source. For example, you can go back and read Gilgamesh, and there's Noah and the flood off the bat, like so common source right there.
But even geographically, what if we're geographically isolated? Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah, and this was the thing I was thinking of as you were telling these similarities, between Revelation and Zeus and Kronos, and is that a real parallel, or is us learning this new language now causing us to see parallels that aren't really there? So that those false positives, the pattern recognitions that humans are so famous for making.
Oh yeah.
And so the language that you speak causes you to see things in a different way than you would through a different language. I've been exploring modernism and the Enlightenment, and the philosophers at the time who were critical of the Enlightenment that we seem to have forgotten. And there was a German philosopher by the name of Mahan who argued that you can't actually think without language. Thinking is using language. You don't have a thought and then translate it into a language. You don't articulate the thought that you had prior to language. You are thinking in language.
I have heard of some people that don't have a head voice, that literally just think in symbols and images.
Well, and that might go back to my friend's argument about mathematics being a language. Is that a different kind of symbolic representation of the world that they're using? Because that's all language is metaphorical associations of arbitrary sounds with other things in the world, and a sort of code. And so to learn a different language might be to open up a completely different set of possible ideas. And my recent project I've been or hobby has been researching Marxism.
It seemed like there was a fair bit of
especially
Marxism in towards the end.
Well, that was just the surface layer. What I've been doing since the book, mostly thanks to James Lindsay, an absolutely excellent scholar and has done phenomenal research. But I think George Orwell noticed this too, is that there's a peculiar kind of language that Marxists use, and that's unique to Marxists. And you can see this with social justice warriors too. But even back in the 1940s, 1950s, George Orwell was noticing like the Marxists don't use Greek and Latin roots; they use Russian and French roots, which sort of makes sense, given that they were mostly writing in France and Russia and Germany. But it was still, one wonders if the language that they were writing in had an effect on the sorts of ideas that they would eventually come to. That's been an interesting possibility to explore, because the languages have the heroic stories of that language embedded in them. The concept of the hero is, etymologically associated with Hercules, for example, perhaps before any others, even before Achilles. Achilles was the first great hero, but then Hercules was, named after the concept.
Yeah, and so yeah, I've come across that. I've had a friend say she's been saying it for years that language is it sort of gives you the guidelines as to how that culture and those people viewed the world based on, and one of the things about what I was saying earlier about English kind of being limited is the fact that we only have the book, the sun, the moon.
Yes.
And so picking up, my German's rusty, but one of the things that we constantly argued about is the whole, we love the solar sky father, it's all very masculine and everything. Well, in the Germanic cultures, which is a large percentage of our Northern European ancestry, it is always die Sonne and der Mond. The moon is masculine, the sun is feminine, but the sky is masculine and the night is feminine. So there's always this yin yang balance.
Interesting.
And so that just gives you the breakdown of like, okay, well, let's get into the mindset of these people. What was it about the sun for Germanics and Scandinavians that made it feminine?
Well, so here's another tricky problem with translation too. My understanding of as the term is used in linguistics is gender, and whether a term is masculine or feminine, it isn't necessarily comparable. And I might be misunderstanding this, correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's not the same concept as gender as we think of men and women biologically speaking. Yeah. It's more of a grammatical thing. So to say der Sonne is not the same as, or die Sonne, I'm sorry. I should know this from listening to Rammstein. No. But
that's how every North American learns German.
The only way. Yeah.
Yes.
But is that the same thing as saying that the sun is like a woman? Or is it a grammatical thing?
Yeah, that I'm not sure about. I don't know. I think that's a limitation of our
curiosities of translation just within English, and the connotations that can come along with that can snowball out of control.
Yeah. And I want to, seeing as how we're sort of talking about language, another note that I'm just seeing here about the thing is that, what got us started on this discussion about language is that it's not just a factor of translation and the numerous words that we can get from ancient and distant languages, but also that these are all translated by people who had certain ideas. And I know Jack has pointed out numerous times that every story in our history was written down by a person who had their ideals and their translation and their vision of it. And in that is Achilles, the Achilles that we read about. Is that what he was like?
Yeah, that is the interesting question. And the challenge I tried to pose in the book is that one of the dangers of pursuing heroism, which I present as the idea of pursuing immortality through the word, immortality through song and poetry and epics like Homer's, is that there's, within a localized culture, it seems like a reasonable proposition, but times change and language changes and people change and the meanings of words change. And if your immortality is maintained through a mercurial and fluid medium like language, what does it mean to be immortal in that? There's no there's no stability to the substance of what made you, what made your events great, or at least there's reason to doubt it. I mean, there's still something, when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's still something viscerally, universally there that grabs our attention, is what keeps drawing people back to reading it after thousands of years. But it's not 100%, but what is still there is what makes it so fascinating and incredible and worth reading. And it's in part, I believe, because our culture is built on these stories. So we have a connection built there, and our languages as well. We have this word hero. That's an English word, but there it is at the opening of the Iliad. Heroon, men who were heroes.
Yeah. Oh god, I think I just totally lost what I was going to point out there, what I was going to request. Anyway, yeah, that happens here and there. Just lose the train of thought. Yeah,
We can blame language on that one.
yeah, exactly. Just trying to balance too many things. I was sort of glancing quickly at my notes to see how can I donkey bridge this in Eselsbrücke. I always when you're learning German, that's what they say when you build a donkey bridge in Eselsbrücke. It's when you're building a link between a term in one language and a term in the other, and so that when you think of one, you're like, okay, wait, yeah, and you think of your donkey bridge, and
I try not to make an ass.
Yeah, and I when I was learning German, I purposely I was like Eselsbrücke, no, Ziegerbrücke, goat bridge instead, and so making a false donkey bridge, goat bridge, I was like, yeah, okay, that's how I'll remember the term. I made a goat bridge out of a donkey bridge. Yeah, it's stupid. Absolutely stupid.
German words I remember are like Lebensgefährlich, which we saw at the front of a cave for spelunking.
Oh yeah.
Which I guess literally meant danger for your life or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember Messer and Schmetterling and
knife,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
7, 8, 9. And our North American accents are probably horrible for any of my German friends who are listening.
Certainly, yeah.
I think if anyone's, it's only going to be Svantje and Chris who are going to be listening. So forgive me, you two. What else we got here? Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the word and words and everything. I thought that your inclusion of Jesus into the book came out of left field. I was not expecting that, and when I first opened up the book and was looking through the first table of contents, and I see the ascendance of Aletheia, Jesus, I was like, oh, interesting. And so I fought the urge to flick forward to part 2, but I thought that was a really clever part, and I've told a couple of my Christian friends and my pastor buddy, I sent him a picture of the page where I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but Jesus is the hero. And I sent him a picture of that, and he was so intrigued. He bought the Kindle version of your book right away.
Oh cool. Yeah. Well, I'm sure he won't agree with the conclusion, but
yeah,
I mean, it wasn't something I had gone into this project expecting to touch on, but I was reading there's a Harvard philologist named Greg Nage, who I reference extensively. Brilliant scholar, absolutely worth reading if you have any interest at all in Homer. And most of his work is available online for free anyways, which is super cool. But in reading his book, The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, I was raised Christian, and I spent some time studying Christian theology in a fair bit of depth. And so I'm familiar with a lot of the, I mean, I didn't go to seminary or anything like that, but I'm familiar enough to be fluent. I've had conversations with some, the Godcast folks over on TRS and Jay Dyer, for some if Orthodox debater guy, if some people are familiar. So I know what I'm looking at with Christian theology, and in reading through this, Greg Nage's book, all of these concepts kept jumping out that are like, it's almost too perfect. It almost looks like someone compiled all of the disparate elements of heroism that you see in not just the Iliad and Homer's works, but also in Hesiod, also in Aeschylus, also in Euripides, and they combined them in one tale that was also written in Greek. Incidentally, the Old Testament was written in Aramaic, but the New Testament was written in Greek. And so you see a lot of those words pop up as well in the New Testament, and it almost reads as if Jesus was the culmination of heroism. Am I plot spoiling things, or
no? I'm just making some notes that I don't want to forget to bring up towards the once you've continued. Please continue though.
Yeah, and so it may interest some people just to see Jesus as the ultimate hero, but when you think about it, it makes sense intuitively, because if heroism is about achieving immortality through the word and through songs, can you think of a person whose story has been told more, has more songs written about them?
Yeah, exactly. I found that spicy. I found that I loved how you kind of pointed out that, like, by the pagan standard, by like the Indo-European standard of what makes a hero is how many songs of grandeur and worship are about them. And almost every Sunday I'm sitting down and listening to
Hillsong's.
Yeah, I can't even think of what some of the words are to them right now. It's I'm sorry to say if you listen to this, Matt, I'm sorry, but the song.
Yeah. Well, some of them are almost Bronze Age. This is not going to sound like the battle taunts of the warriors on the Scamandrian fields, but I mean, a song like "What a Beautiful Name It Is" is I mean, one of the chapters one of the themes Greg Nage dwells on a lot that I didn't delve into because I'm had other things to talk about and not the expertise that he has, but is the idea that Achilles, and indeed many of these heroes, are depicted as ideal bridegrooms. This is this concept of beauty in death, and the tragedy of their death is emphasized by the fact that they were idealized as an ideal bridegroom who never gets to actually marry. And we see that in a lot of Christian songs too, of Jesus as this ideal bridegroom. It's just one among dozens and dozens and dozens of thematic crossovers that don't seem nearly as Semitic as they seem Hellenic, just sort of
so that's that brings me to sort of a junction that I want to talk about. There's two things I kind of want to cover that split from this same topic. First one I'll go to is has little less to do with your book, and I'll leave the main point. It has to do with your book for after, but what you're talking about, that so many of these things, and that it seems like a whole bunch of different stories and idyllic people, gods, heroes kind of got rolled into one with Jesus, is I also just read Brian Murarescu's The Immortality Key, where he have you read it yet?
I read the first 20 pages of it and I gave it to a friend.
That didn't set the hook in for you.
No, not really. It's an interesting thesis, and there's certainly something there. It's I'm sure it's the sort of thing that will be extremely interesting to a lot of people. But I think he's got something there, and it's interesting, but I had other things, and it was less like, I'm not convinced, screw this book. It was more like, I know a guy who would absolutely love this concept, and I'm reading 8 other books over here. So
that's fair,
kind of thing.
I was just going to touch on that. He's got the whole pagan continuity thing where to enable, and we know that as Christianity spread, I mean, so many of the Christian holidays are just pagan holidays. I mean, look at Christmas. We got bringing the evergreen tree inside, putting lights on it, passing around gifts. Someone is, winter solstice is just Christmas, and da-da-da. And the historical Yeshua probably wasn't born on the solstice. I think that I read, like, what is it? Some Islamic scholars say born sometime in spring or something like that, probably.
I remember hearing something like that. I can't remember a source.
So anyway, and I really liked the idea that Brian put forth, that Jesus is just essentially has had Dionysus and the wine god and the fertility god kind of just rolled into him, and that is what allowed Christianity to spread so much. And we've already, a lot of people in these circles probably are aware of, Christianity just stole and plagiarized and put a Christian mask on all these pagan holidays, but I hadn't come across it yet talking about it piggybacking on Greek legend. And given the geographic proximity, that seems much more likely than the jump up to the Germanic holidays.
Yeah, the Dionysus link is an old theory, and there's definitely some thematic crossovers. And as we were talking about before, all human civilizations are going to have certain themes that universally are cared about, and different combinations of gods are going to represent combinations of those values differently. it's very common to have a thundering sky god as the chief. We have Zeus. One of the things that makes the Norse pantheon interesting is that instead of having a thundering sky god as the chief, although there are some signs that Tyr was originally the chief, in the Norse pantheon, you have a psychopomp as the chief god, which is interesting, and different.
Yes.
There are some thematic crossovers between Jesus and Dionysus for sure, especially the resurrection aspect, especially the eternal return. But without saying anything about my personal beliefs, a reason I would be skeptical of that link is that one of the men who did the most research into both Christian theology and origins and stuff, and really psychoanalyzing the early writings, and who was an enormous student of Dionysus, was Friedrich Nietzsche. And he absolutely loved the latter, and he didn't hate Jesus. He thought Jesus was sort of interesting, but he hated Paul. He hated Paul with a deep passion. And he thought Christianity was more a product of Paul than of Jesus. And he, after all of his research into Christianity and his linguistic study, because Nietzsche was, before he was a philosopher, he was a philologist. He studied language and translations and the sorts of things we're talking about here. And the fact that he did not see any connection between Jesus and Dionysus, despite seeing weird dietary links between cultures and values. Like he said that the Chinese have this affinity for Buddhism because of their rice consumption. Like he may or may not have been right about that, but he was definitely thinking about physiological causes and nutritional causes. So,
totally. I can see that.
His association of intoxication, and he hated alcohol too, but was a fan of the intoxication of springtime and perhaps other things associated with Dionysus, and saw no sign of that in Christianity, is enough to make me prima facie skeptical.
Fair. And so, we just touched on Buddhism there. That's perfect into another one that I wanted to ask about is you talk frequently about the experience in oh my goodness, I'm blanking on it, with the lotus eaters, and that that promise or pursuit of enlightenment seems to tamp out the drive for real world adventure, and that struggle and overcoming. And a lot of us seem to, at least in people I've been talking to, we're drawn to a fair amount of Eastern lingo and themes. But are these things that really sit with is it a Western mindset or a Western soul? Is it that Faustian soul of wanting to overcome versus it seems to be a very Eastern concept of the renunciation of this physical world. And I've heard a couple of good arguments that, a couple people figure that Yeshua, Jesus, went and trained in basically ashrams in the East and brought Buddhism back with like a Roman Western spin to it. And if you look at a lot of all the Christianity is, my kingdom is not of this world, and don't worry about this world. You'll receive your blessings in the kingdom of heaven with the Father. And that's one thing that has, no matter how many, moralistic things I do find myself agreeing with Christianity, that whole renunciation of this world, don't worry about it here. As long as you go by these guidelines, you'll inherit the kingdom of heaven. Everything will be perfect after. And while I have no doubt that I don't doubt whatsoever there is some sort of afterlife or other world where some degree of consciousness persists. I don't know for sure, but I know I'm here for sure. And so is that, the lotus eaters, and you pointed out that the lotus is a symbol of a lot of Eastern cultures. Is it the hero exists? He achieves heroism essentially at the point of death and leaving this world, if I've understood some argument portion correct. is that, but not in a matter of a renunciation of this world, but in struggle and strife against this world, he loses his life and becomes a hero.
I'm not sure if it's correct to say struggling against this world per se. I think what we see, at least in the Iliad, and there are other heroic stories, but we see a struggle against the gods themselves in order to be worthy of being closer to the gods. There are a number of instances in the Iliad where we see a character described as Dionysus, which means like a superhuman spirit or like a god. And then they immediately die. Like, 5 minutes later.
All right, you reach that threshold. Come on board.
Yeah. And so the question is, like, is it worth death to be like a god for a minute? And I mean, that's what makes them worth writing about and singing about and writing poetry about. It's unclear what the nature of this afterworld is. I mean, there are many Platonic dialogues where different characters give different ideas about what this afterlife may or may not be like, whether it exists. And there doesn't seem to be in the East or the West a clear consensus on the matter. I mean, people think of the East and they think of Buddhism, which is certainly a strong influence. But there's also Taoism, and there's also Confucianism, and Zen Buddhism is not the same as other forms of Buddhism. And here in the West, we have different schools as well. I mean, in recent history, we have, the Enlightenment has been quite influential, but also very influential was the Romantic movement, which was sort of a counter-Enlightenment. And the East and West is more helpful as a basic, perhaps linguistic.
Oh, I'm painting with very broad strokes when I say those.
Then it is an ideological thing, because there are Stoicism has many similarities to Buddhism, and you're 100% correct. With Christianity, keep your treasures in heaven. Those who love the world have not the love of the Father in them. All that kind of thing. Very, very related to. They don't have the emphasis on being blown out, as it were. They kind of go the opposite direction. They want to have this eternal Zoe life, this life of the spirit that never ceases. Which is different than you get the sense with Buddhism that they want to actually cease that spirit. And that the aspiration for that, there's peace in that, or
what is that moksha, that liberation, reaching nirvana, where you cease to reincarnate, where you join with Brahma?
Yeah, my understanding is that nirvana literally translates as being blown out. Whereas, the depiction that Jesus gives of the man who's living in the spirit is not being blown out, but rather being like the wind. He says to the man, he says, it comes and goes, and no one knows where it comes from or goes to. That's what it's like.
Freedom from samsara.
Kind of a cryptic description, but in juxtaposition with being blown out, I think there's something there.
Yeah. The one of the things I'm chatting with that pastor buddy of mine, they talked about some passage where he said that basically anywhere that seems like a missing scene in the Bible, like where if I can't think of exactly what example he gave, but I, in conversation with him, likened it to the scene where Pontius Pilate, where he's about to hand off Jesus. And I noticed that in I listened to a theosophy lecture about analyzing John and that section, and he says that when Pontius Pilate says, "What is truth?" when he's speaking with Jesus, and the theology professor, the way that he analyzed it, and I found this super intriguing. He said, and Pontius Pilate basically shrugs it off and says, "What is truth?" and passes him back to the crowd. But I was very drawn to Mr. Mel Gibson's adaptation of it in The Passion, where he's speaking with Jesus, and he goes like, "What is truth?" and he looks him like deep in the eye and he does the close up, and then cut scene and he's saying that I see no reason for the charges against this man. And I found that much, much, much more intriguing because that missing scene allows you to fill in like, oh, what could he have said to him? And Mel Gibson made it seem more like Pontius Pilate was genuinely asking Jesus, what is truth? Tell me. Whereas this theology professor, at least in the one lecture that I listened to, was saying that he's basically mocking Jesus, like, what is truth? I'm in power. Here you go, whatever. And so, yeah, the pastor buddy of mine, he was basically just saying that whenever there's a missing scene, what seems to be like a missing scene in the Bible, that's for you to put yourself into that place and you get to fill in that void.
Yeah, that caught my eye because I remember reading it myself as a retort, and it seems I started Googling when you said that because I had to double check. It seems that some translations have said, what is truth? Pilate asked. And others say, what is truth? Retorted Pilate. That's what the international version says.
See those issues with people's translations.
And so Bible Hub has the Greek, and so we can look it up real quick. I spent a lot of time studying the Iliad on Bible Hub. Not gonna lie.
Nice. Cool.
Because it has all these Greek translations. It's an excellent source. Says to him, lege is the word. And so it seems like Mel Gibson might be onto something. It seems like it seems like retort might have been an over translation.
Interesting.
Unless lege has some connotation I'm not aware of, but the other uses seem to be pretty just said.
Interesting. And I mean that's also,
dangers of translation.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know what the context of this note was that I put here, but you pointed out that Jesus himself identified as the word and the truth. So Pontius saying, what is truth? And he could have just been like, me, I am truth.
Yeah. I mean, that is theologically, he is the reincarnation of the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah. And so now, the title of your book, your most recent book, is The Hero and the Man. And, Jesus essentially was a hero and a man. They speak of the Son of Man and the Son of God.
Well, and it's also for people who want to go down rabbit holes, there's a fascinating world of history in the 3rd and 4th century theology disputes of all the heresies that came. Is Jesus just a man, or is he God and not man?
Well, we're just going to read the faith and moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth anyway.
Yeah, they always came in pairs, and it became very essential to Christian doctrine that Jesus was both hero and was both God and man. I'm getting caught up here.
We'll try and get back to your book in a minute here. I know we're kind of
but the sense of the man that I was talking about with the title of my book is not just man in a biological sense. It's not like as they say in the Big Lebowski, is like pair of testicles and you're good to go. It has to do with the archetype that is Homer describes in Odysseus. Andra moi enepe musa malapola is this complicated man of twists and turns who suffered much and who had gone all these different ways. And it's a personality that evolves out of the hero. And it's it's an unfortunate term because man has such a clear understanding in the context of our society. It's first of all, we have this this idea we get from Jack Donovan of a man is someone with strength, courage, mastery, and honor. At least that's the core of what it means to be masculine as a man. These are the things that we value in men universally. And then we have the biological sense of a man as like a person with testicles. But what we see in Homer is this a different kind of idealized personality, a different an idealized archetype, or perhaps a destination that you achieve after a journey through a heroic phase. And you can't get there without having passed through that heroic phase. But hopefully you make it through there alive. That's
Yeah, I
ideal.
liked your let's see, did I dog ear that page? I really liked your flow chart of how the initiation through that, heroic undertaking can lead to either the joining of your culture that you're in and becoming a man, and then there's that other branch that can lead to the disillusionment. And
Yes.
there we go, crisis, disillusionment. We got adolescent male has initiation or non-initiation. I don't think this is too much of a spoiler. Everyone's gonna buy the book as soon as they hear that we're doing this. Crisis leads to nous.
Noos, yes.
Or disillusionment and the triumphal return, which of course then would probably lead to the Joseph Campbell cycle, hero's journey that can eternally spiral. But I really liked your approach to that disillusionment being an overabundance of I'm really stumbling on words here, an overabundance of ideology or a wishing that things were much more perfect than they are, which I guess is the core of disillusionment. But
and you can tie this one back to language too. You can say that disillusionment begins with mistaking the map for the terrain, mistaking the words for the things that they are supposed to represent. I mean, for me, this was a rather personal experience because I spent much of my early 20s as a fanatical crusader for free speech. And I had a very literal understanding of what free speech meant and what it was. And so when I discovered, in my late 20s, early 30s, that actually this literal extreme position of free speech is impossible. It's not functional. It's not desirable. It's easy to get disillusioned, to be like, that's not even this thing that I had valued so much and invested so much to defend is maybe not worth defending at all. And that's the risk of disillusionment. That's you get so interested in the word, in the phrase free speech and the literal meaning of what that phrase is. You go to your little dictionary. It's like, what does this mean? But when you look past the directed meaning and you say, what is it that the people were trying to convey with this phrase? What is it that they were trying to convey? And you say they're trying to articulate a certain way of living where we can speak more freely to each other. All of this literalism about what about libel, or what about a fire in a crowded theater, to take a bad example. A libel is the good example. Things like that. It's irrelevant to the spirit of the meaning that they're trying to convey. And Bruce Lee had this famous line of, don't concentrate on the finger pointing to the moon or you'll miss all the heavenly glory. It's so easy for people to get caught up in the words. And that's the heroic allure. That's the heroic danger, because, and that's what gives rise to the thought that heroism might be possible, that words can carry us forward into the future. And perhaps we have to go through that in order to even be able to communicate with other people.
Yeah, totally.
Without words.
Yeah. And I liked, I think we said earlier on in this chat, you made a reference to Redditors that, you wrote somewhere in here, obviously not quoting directly, but you said something along the lines of, we get so obsessed with words and what they're trying to convey that we end up missing out on the actual experience of that, as you said. And I'm wondering if that was one of your approaches towards where that branch in the hero and the man is, where the man stops focusing on just the ideal attainment and instead kind of goes with the flow and kind of falls short in a couple areas, but that opens up new pathways. And rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater, basically just gets to experience the fullness of life rather than being, having blinders on and focusing on one goal.
Yeah, it's interesting. I imagine different people arrive at that through different paths. The classical Greek tragedy path is anagnorisis and peripeteia. There's a reversal of fortune that reveals sort of what someone did wrong, and then there's a recognition, a seeing of their true self and their true position and things. And tragedy is the usual means by which the extremity of the heroism is revealed, but we still love them for it. They have too much of a good thing, and it causes them great suffering. And the recognition is that moment where they realized, I took this concept that is a general good literal to such an extreme that it actually caused harm.
So ideally, I mean, we've talked at Halathaz about the general concept of we want to be heroes for the new age, but I mean, it seems to me like generally we don't want to be heroes, but we might end up being heroes.
Well, you want to be connected with the heroes that built your society.
And then heroes might come and go that you then go, oh man, wow, look what they did.
Yeah, well, and Alan Moore, the occultist and writer, people might know him from V for Vendetta and Watchmen and other great comic books, essentially, like that. Famously said that all culture comes from cult, and specifically it comes from hero cults. Hero cults are what build our cultures or build our civilizations. You could say that all of Greece and indeed all of Europe and the Western world is built on the heroism of the Iliad. And so if we lose that connection, if we lose that hero cult, we lose our civilization. We lose and that's not some weird abstraction of like we lose like this word civilization. No, we lose the narrative bonds that connect us and give us an opportunity to connect and understand each other and to be on the same page, for our language to mean the same thing to each other. That's what it means to have this civilizational connection. We are in the same hero cult, just as Christians are in the same hero cult. Here, I mean cult in the neutral sense, not the modern negative sense.
I think that we have very few Christians who listen, maybe a handful, but
okay, yeah, maybe this one podcast.
Yes.
But I think the thing to do, especially if you're a young man, is there needs to be some period of time where you take on the identity of heroes of the past, where you, if not become a hero yourself, you, in a manner, become heroes of old time. And whether that means reenacting their actions with like joining the military or going off and doing something that was important to you. One of my favorite examples in more recent times, a tragic case because they took away the opportunity a few years ago, but there was a young gentleman named Christopher McManus, a young kid who ran away from home and lived out of his vehicle and as a road bum for 18 months. And he ended up going into the Alaskan wilderness.
Oh, yeah.
And eventually died in this van. And there's a book, Into the Wild, that...
Okay. As soon as you said Alaska, I was like, okay, yeah.
And he is an interesting case because what you see with Chris McCandless, who in many ways embodied the sort of American go west young man spirit, he was an extraordinarily well-read and intelligent young man. Managed to do quite well for himself on the road until he got unlucky with some plants. What you saw there, at least for a couple of years, was the beginning of a formation of an organic hero cult. People started making pilgrimages to the bus.
So naturally, a hero must be to become a hero is to have a tragic end before your time.
And one of the important aspects of a hero cult is physical proximity, especially to where the hero's remains are or where they died. So for Chris McCandless, that was his bus. in Alaska, but they moved that, so they took that out. Another interesting possible hero cult that could have formed but didn't was the case of Marvin Heemeyer and his bulldozer in Colorado. Was it Granby? They made sure to get rid of that because they didn't want anything like that happening, just as they did that to William Wallace in Scotland. But in America, what we have is Arlington National Cemetery, and a variety of different grave sites. But I would say the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is probably the most important for the hero cult that unites America. Although I'm not sure that's under some siege right now. I don't know how they're going to remove that, though.
Yeah, you guys have a totally different vet and military culture. I mean, anytime I've flown in the States, it's like, would everyone please rise? We have some vets on board, or we have, and obviously we just don't have that in the Free People's Republic up here.
Well, and I mean, the American Revolution is such a core part of the mythic story of America. So anyone who joins the military, especially in a combat role, especially if you end up in special forces, if you are a Green Beret or a SEAL, you're basically a hero off the bat. And not even necessarily because you did anything. You could have been part of SEAL Team 4 or something and like did your 4 tours, stuck on a submarine in the Pacific, because you got unlucky, and then you join the reserves, and then never you go anywhere. Doesn't matter. Everyone loves you, right? And that's because you've taken on that identity of the heroes that made up America's past by going through the motions that they did. And so the best way, I think, to be a hero is to do that. It doesn't make you a hero in the sense of someone who will necessarily have stories told about you. You usually need to do something new and different or exemplary and suffer tremendously, probably die.
It must, yes.
And that becomes the new extreme, the new thing that people talk about, like, wow, wasn't that interesting? What would be, it would have been fascinating if a few years ago, instead of exiling himself in an Ecuadorian, was it Ecuador? I don't remember, if Julian Assange had somehow managed to get killed. That could have been a potential for a 21st century hero story. Not necessarily a desirable one, but just from the themes of what's possible.
Absolutely. Now that sort of ties in. I mean, now that we're getting into contemporary stuff rather than talking about biblical and Iliad and Odyssey, will we see? And you mentioned the Into the Wild guy and Killdozer guy, but I'm blanking on the names. Will we see new heroes form in real time, or is it something that happens generations later as people read back and reflect on, wow, this person did this? And I'm sure that lots of people spoke about Jesus or other historical figures that over the course of the translations and games of telephone of the generations and centuries became something else, and just like Achilles, may not anymore represent what they were actually about, but still inspire us regardless of that fact.
Oh man, that's a tough one. I mean, the historical precedent is, generations later. The Iliad and the Odyssey were written in about the 8th, 9th century BC, and the events of the Trojan War took place in the 12th, 13th century. So 400 years later, essentially, that's when these heroes became like truly venerated. Although there are supposedly stories, even at the time of the Trojan War. So hard to know for sure. But I mean, a film comes to my mind, The Revenant, of a particular mountain man whose name escapes me.
Filmed in my town.
And he died in the 1880s or something. This is the gentleman, for those of you who aren't aware, who was abandoned by his hunting party after he got mauled by a bear, and he managed to crawl his way back to town hundreds of miles away, point his gun at the man who did it to him and then not shoot as a kind of point of vengeance. And it was written about in the early 19 teens, 1918, 1917. It was the Plains Cycle or something. It was a young man, 19, 20-year-old, who was trying to emulate Homer of all people. And he wrote this cycle of epic poems about Hugh Glass. That was his name. And a number of other mountain men about the West. And I mean, no one paid attention to it, I don't think, really, at the time. And now we have film. But where that might change is all these heroes of the past were a product of the medium by which they became heroized, made into heroes, which was epic poetry. What's our medium now? We have film. We have the internet. How long does it take for a meme to be made?
I think they're made just before the thing actually happens. It's like a Schrodinger's meme.
Sometimes, yes.
The meme exists as the event happens.
Well, not to get too spicy, but there were some memes coming out of Ukraine that came in advance too. So
there's only a couple spice limits on this that I don't want to touch, and I'm sure that we're on the same page. But yes.
More than a few seconds.
So ultimately, I mean, the heroism seems like something that we don't necessarily have control over being hero. It's something over being a hero and being ultimately venerated. It's something that we aim towards and ultimately basically have to be martyred for the cause that we are going for, or the symbol, or the ideal that we're going for. And that if we don't get martyred, if we don't die while aiming for that, ultimately the goals will change and adapt and evolve, as all things in life do. And through that, you end up being the man of twists and turns, and you become the man. So it's almost like if shoot for the moon, because if you miss, you'll end up among the stars, where the moon is heroism and the stars is manhood, right? So you always want to, it seems you always want to aspire to that heroic goal, but ultimately you probably don't really want to end up a hero, as that's the tragic ending. But it seems ultimately like it's probably a win-win situation, even though Achilles in Hades would probably disagree that maybe he's not being remembered exactly the way he wants. And yet we're still inspired by all of those things. So is the goal to inspire other young men, or is the goal to be remembered specifically as we want to be remembered?
Well, I think we want to be remembered is what inspires young men. So there's kind of no way of getting around that. But what the way it was put in the Iliad, where you have a number of instances of old men trying their best to instruct young men in exactly this matter, is there's a beautiful metaphorical story, an Ainos, as Greg Nash would put it, of at the very end of the book, they're at Patroclus' funeral, and they have a bunch of gains, and there's this chariot race, and Nestor is instructing his son on how best to win this chariot race. And he says, here's what you must do, and it's this very long description of how Nestor is speaking to his son. So you have to take your chariot just so and get as close as you can to this inside boundary marker, but don't touch it. Get close, and that's how it'll swing your chariot around and bring you back to the starting line. And the turning point is the tomb of an unknown hero from ages past. And I think that's the metaphor that Homer is trying to leave with the audience of, you use heroism as a boundary marker and a turning post. This is something that our civilization literally revolves around, and that you must revolve around as a young man. But be careful not to touch it, not to get too close. And in the end, his son did get too close, not in the chariot race, but later. He ended up sacrificing his own life to save his father. Maybe a heroic way to go.
Awesome. Well, that felt like a very organic way to climax this chat here. That felt like a cap to it. Unless have I left out? Was there anything that you wanted to return to or expand upon in any way here? I mean, there always will be, but anything in particular
with Homer, you could go on for days.
Yeah,
there's so much content. And there's still so much more for me to explore too. I'm by no means even an expert on this. I've just found this one thing that was worth writing about.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the whole journey. I mean, all of us we all recognize that we will. All I know is I know nothing. We want to start, and there's more information and more things to enjoy and indulge in than we possibly can in this life.
Yeah.
So let's hope that we return and can get that ancestral spiritual memory going, tap into the records of the cosmos and read up on all that. Blah blah. Anyway, thank you, Chris, for sitting down and having a chat with me. I'll end the recording in just a sec here, and you and I can banter about whatever for a couple more minutes. But everyone listening, C.B. Robertson, The Hero and the Man, Language, Truth, and the Homeric Origins of Western Idealism. Is it available? Where can they find all of your stuff? Is it Amazon?
Just Jeff Bezos's website for the time being.
Bezos. All right. Well, if you buy enough of Chris's books, Chris can go get a cup of coffee, and Bezos can dismantle another Belgian bridge. So, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. It's 200 pages. You could sit down and take it in one go, but I would recommend numerous reads through. I'm gonna crack through a couple other books and then return to it because it seems like one that every time I go through it, I'll pull out something new. So, Chris, thank you very much.
Excellent.
The Hero and the Man. Everyone, go pick it up right now.
Thanks so much, Kyle.